Welcome back. Today's podcast is a collaboration between two websites that we work with, one being armscart.com and the other being defile.com or defile.com, however you want to say it. And we'll post links in the description on where you can go to check out those websites. One's a firearm-centric website, and the other is a prepper and survivalism and preparedness website. So today we want to talk a little bit about giving a broad overview of lethality and stopping power in ammunition, including some information about stopping power and how penetration metrics work with stopping a threat. So generally speaking, the idea that there's a minimum standard of 12 inches of penetration that must be met in order for a specific defensive round to be considered effective. We thought we'd take on this question a little bit because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and the physics and the science of ballistics is pretty weird. It doesn't make sense every single time, and ballistics in general is a science that contributes to wholesale projectile and ammunition design changes that continue to evolve, and they're just getting better from a scientific perspective and from a design perspective and a manufacturing perspective that helps us deliver better stopping power as users of those projectiles and the loads that are paired with them. So, and this is across the board, with hunting projectiles versus self-defense or duty projectiles, and as well as with the way that powder is used in conjunction with a projectile and the way that specific loads are made to be tailored towards stopping power. So we just want to start with the idea that there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of public information that might not be misinformation, but it's really hard to understand if you just look at it from an overview or a glancing perspective. And that's what most of the issue is with the information that's out there, is that it's not a comprehensive deep dive. And most people don't like doing comprehensive deep dives into complex subject matter that may not be very interesting, except to learn what the conclusion is. And so today we're going to go a little bit further than most discussions go on ballistics, specifically talking about stopping power, which is a metric that is impossible to define aside from stopping a threat. The conversation today, though, is going to talk about the different variables and the different metrics that come into play to help a consumer or even a professional user of projectiles, loads, cartridges, ammunition in general, determine the best way to evaluate the stopping power of a specific round or load. And we're going to talk a little bit about ballistic gelatin, but only in the sense to give background information. What we'd really like to talk about today is just, the concepts surrounding stopping power or lethality or terminal ballistics. So the most important thing here that we can talk about is the important fact that stopping power is really an equation that involves a lot of different variables, and that there's not a super reliable or super repeatable formula or a scientific baseline to determine stopping power. So let's talk about the variables that kind of come along with that. And so if you read this article in its written format, you can see it's listed in a bullet point format. And we'll kind of go through some of those now. So stopping power is about incapacitating a target, but targets vary. A reliable metric that can help identify general stopping capabilities is blood loss, right? The problem is that with all of these variable targets that somebody might be attempting to stop, there's different volumes of blood. Certain targets can function with less blood than others. It's based on a lot of related variables as well. So moving on from that concept and having that as the background, it's important to understand that that is one of the more reliable factors in understanding stopping power, right? Generally speaking, a living target, once it's lost enough blood that it can no longer function reliably, it stops. So blood loss is a very reliable indicator, even if the variables are so widely different between target types. Okay, so the mass of a projectile can create different wound channels. But the other things that factor in are velocity, distance from the muzzle, the projectile coatings, designs, and a lot of other things, including wound channel width, wound channel depth, wound channel design or makeup, bullet travel pathways. There's a lot of things that come into play that can either help or hurt your stopping power. So we hear a lot of concept about minimal penetration depth. And generally that number is pegged at about 12 inches, 13 inches of penetration in standard ballistic gelatin, 10%. So that's been the baseline for many years, and it's brought on by the FBI, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. They do the trend analysis of data, and they do testing to determine lethality and other things, kind of as the brain trust for law enforcement communities generally. The minimum penetration depth can help improve the chances of hitting vital organs, and that's the baseline concept behind a minimum penetration variable. So if you're able to penetrate that, you're able to have penetrate that depth, you're able to have across most targets or a majority of targets the best opportunity to stop that target, because you have enough penetration where you could have organ disruption, vital organ hits. Again, not a super reliable indicator for guaranteed stopping power, but generally deeper penetrations correlated more positively with stopping a threat from an efficiency perspective. So layers are also important. The average human skin elasticity probably takes away the first 2 to 3, maybe even 4 inches of penetration depth, because the way that a bullet impacts the skin and the elasticity contained within the skin causes, and I know this is kind of a macabre subject, and I probably should have started with a trigger warning, but generally speaking, the elasticity of a human target's skin is important to understand when it comes to penetration, because even though it seems like skin is really easy to penetrate or really easy to go through, especially with a high velocity or higher velocity projectile, it simply has an impact on the ballistic lethality, because it is so elastic. And we can use the example of, say, mountain goats or certain game targets when hunting. Certain targets will have much more resistance to the load or to the projectile hitting them and stopping them easily because of the toughness of their skin. One extreme example would be, high altitude mountain goats, etc. They tend to have tougher skin, and because their body is made up of more muscle tissue than fat, the combination of the skin thickness and toughness, as well as the fact that they don't wash regularly or clean regularly, their matted hair can also become a determining factor in how easy it is to penetrate deep enough to make an efficient kill. And because of that, it's a much tougher animal to dispatch. The same thing is true conceptually in a human target, and I hate to talk about human targets like that, but from a defensive perspective, skin matters, layers matter. So that goes for leather jackets, sweaters, multiple layers of differential armor that might be on there. And I don't just mean body armor, I mean just layers of clothing sometimes can have a huge impact. Also bullet deflection, etc. So that's really important to talk about. And then also deflections is another important category to talk about, because bullet or jacket separation material composition for the makeup of the bullet, those can dramatically improve or make worse ballistic performance. So it's important to understand energy transfer, penetration depth, and wound channel makeup when we're talking about stopping power in general. And I think sometimes that during conversations online about this, these factors aren't brought in. It's just some person saying, "Oh, 45 stops better than 9mm because 45 has more mass or more diameter." Well, yeah, from a physics perspective, that makes sense in a sense, except that the elasticity of his skin is going to make it harder for a larger object to penetrate if it doesn't have a corresponding velocity uptick. That's why 9mm made such a huge comeback, because the trend lines in actual shootings and law enforcement contact have proven that 9mm penetration depth and speed and velocity gains over, say, something like a 40 Smith & Wesson or a 45 have improved the terminal lethality of that round comparatively. Well, it doesn't seem like a 9mm would do better than a 45. The facts simply state that that's the case. Now, there's also skewed results in some respect because there are more law enforcement officers and more data collected in official, crime scenes, etc., where 9mm is a much more popular round than the 45 or the 40. So having access to a much more popular round, those data sets are going to skew slightly. Is it enough to say that the science is wrong about penetration depth and velocity having an important impact on ballistics? No, it's not. But it is an important factor. And so the goal of today is to help you understand how to evaluate ballistic or terminal performance when it comes to a hunting or a self-defense round, as opposed to understanding all of the science that a criminologist or a bullet designer might have to do when trying to come up with innovation or understand why something's behaving a certain way in that field. So anyway, all these studies that have taken place, they can never take all the variables into effect at once. Data sets sometimes only have a certain amount of variables. And so it's such an evolving science. And that's why we see innovation at every gun show we go to, practically. I mean, every 6 months there's a new innovation in projectile design or material composition or load optimization. And those are important incremental increases and improvements in lethality for those that need that. You can also talk about the influence of drugs or body composition or body mass or other things that will dramatically impact stopping power. And that is that a projectile is effective at stopping a given target in a given scenario, but those given scenarios are not always repeatable, right? You're not always going to have a 6'2", 350-pound attacker. That's going to change the variables for a given situation, and therefore it's very hard to find a baseline understanding of why stopping power is different across all scenarios. So it's important to understand some of the most important parts with stopping power come from very few concepts or very few variables. So, for instance, location of a wound channel or location of a projectile hit on a target drastically impacts the ability to stop a target. If you were to hit just about any living target, in the spine or in the brain or in the face or in the heart, or in an artery where it severs the artery, you can almost guarantee there's immediate incapacitation of that target. However, you can also improve guaranteed hit rate by hitting a fleshier part of the body or a more generally exposed part of the body, rather than trying to make premeditated or pre-chosen hits on a target, which are much easier to make if you don't have to make those accurate hits, right? So then we look at the factors of, are there enough hits on target? Are they in an area where there are core organs? Is it a heavier projectile or a larger projectile, or are there multiple wound channels? Those can all increase the ability to stop a target. Energy, delivery, velocity also have outlier information, stuff that is wild, that shows up on the edges of the test data that says, well, this has happened and we don't understand it. But it also contributes positively towards stopping power. So again, 100% of the time on all targets, that's just not a thing when it comes to ballistics or terminal lethality. So multiple wound channels in a core body area, that's a best practice for stopping a threat, generally. But it's also not the conclusive solution. There are a lot of anecdotal, a lot of scientific, and a lot of proof of cases, especially in the law enforcement community, that say a target may not be immediately neutralized by multiple shots to a core body area. And that could be for hundreds of different reasons. So what's the point of all this discussion? The point is, stopping power is not a definitive science-backed concept. And it's definitely not a guarantee, even with overpowering your load or the projectile. What it is a set of best practices based on trending data that helps you to understand how to evaluate stopping power. Okay, so here are some concepts that we can talk about when it comes to stopping power and how to improve ballistic performance when trying to stop a target. So the concept is you can't stop what you don't hit, right? The idea is to make sure that you have hits on target. So a lot of trainers, shooters, anybody in the duty professions, they're not trained to shoot somebody in the spinal cord. That would be ridiculous. They're trained to shoot somebody in the body mass where they know they can get multiple shots on target quickly if need be to neutralize a threat, right? And so you don't aim for a 1.5-inch target in the middle of the nose and eyes unless you have a premeditated shot, for instance, in a precision long-range sniping activity or something like that. Civilians aren't going to be in that position generally. If they are, they're a criminal most of the time, right? So generally speaking, we're trained to shoot at body mass and we're trained to shoot in organ-heavy areas of the body. So if you can hit in those areas, you have a larger likelihood of being able to stop that target. Okay, another concept. You want more penetration generally because it systematically lessens the chances of missing a vital organ or hitting. It increases the chances of hitting a crucial point within a target's body. So if you have deeper penetration, regardless of the mass of the target, say you've got a 400-pound person coming at you, if you're able to penetrate more than 12 inches, the likelihood of hitting an internal organ, in addition to creating a wound channel, which a wound channel can alleviate the body of blood, you also have the chance of hitting an internal organ, which can further cause disruption within that specific case. And so creating wound channels is one part of the equation, but if you're creating a wound channel that's 9 to 15 inches long in a core body area, you have a chance of hitting spleen, liver, lung, kidney, all these things that can cause a problem internally, specifically going back to blood loss or disruption within the wound channel. So these are quicker ways to incapacitate a target. Having the understanding of how that works from a physiological perspective, it makes a lot of sense. The deeper the penetration, the higher chance it is it's going to get through, fat, muscle, other soft tissue, and into an organ that is extremely vulnerable to a bullet hit. Okay. Another concept. Ballistic gelatin is a quasi-equivalent. It's not a one-to-one replacement, okay? It's a quasi-equivalent because it is a replacement for the varied bone and muscle and soft tissue density in a single block. Nobody's body composition, if you were to touch them in the stomach, equates exactly. Maybe there are a few, but it doesn't really equate 1-to-1 with ballistic gelatin. Ballistic gelatin is much harder than the soft tissue in our body. It's much harder than most of the organ tissue in our body. What it is, though, it's a composite or a conglomerate of the different body densities or different densities in organs, tissue, fat, etc., bone in our body that comes together at a percentage of density that is likely to show substantially similar results. So ballistic gelatin is not a one-to-one replacement. If you get specific penetration or specific wound channel production in ballistic gelatin, it's not a one-to-one guarantee that you're going to get the same thing in any specific target, whether it be animal or human, right? So these are important things to understand. It's a quasi-equivalent, and it's a good testing medium. Okay, another concept, more mass equals better penetration, right? From a pure physics perspective, just about every law of physics in movement indicate that if all things were equal, better penetration would be achieved by having similar velocities with higher mass projectiles. That is true from a general perspective. However, it's a lot harder to sling a higher mass projectile for the same diameter with the same amount of powder or same amount of velocity, right? So if a specific load is already maxed out in powder, you're not going to be able to get higher velocities with higher mass projectiles. And so even though the concept is there that a higher mass projectile at the same velocity is going to penetrate deeper, it doesn't necessarily mean that's achievable in the real world. And so while physics laws may apply, they're generalized. They're not necessarily real world tools to use when it comes to choosing an off the shelf load to use for self-defense or duty, right? Another concept, and this is the last of the concepts I think that are important, is that there is a case to be made that hypersonic velocity projectiles sometimes have an immediate devastating impact that equates to total stopping power. Essentially, it is so devastating because it's at such a high velocity. And the science behind it is not necessarily well explored, and it's certainly not well understood because these are outlier cases generally. It doesn't happen 100% of the time. But the concept would be if I used a 338 Lapua Magnum on a small coyote, there's not going to be a whole lot of chance that coyote's limping off and walking away. That's a devastating impact because it's so overpowered and it's so high in velocity that the wound channel and the impact delivery, the muzzle energy to the target energy is so high still when it hits that target, and the body mass and the ability to take that energy delivery and that hyper velocity, the wound channel is so large because of the impact delivery and the way that it shapes throughout the curve of the wound channel that it would be nearly impossible if you were to use such an overpowered round on a target. That's why certain, sniper rifles, etc., certain calibers are used regardless of the situation, because the idea that you want a one-shot kill is so important because you don't know what could happen in those seconds after if the person is still alive. So you try to incapacitate a target when you have the ability to overpower or overwhelm a target with velocity and mass. You generally take it. Again, we're not talking about this from the perspective of a citizen. We're talking about this from the perspective of a duty officer or a military application. Obviously, if you were making a premeditated shot at a long distance with a precision rifle, that makes you a criminal, generally speaking, in just about everywhere, in every jurisdiction. So, again, this is more the science behind it or the ideas behind evaluating terminal ballistics, not necessarily a use case or a best practices for how to shoot people. That's not what this concept is. It's a concept of understanding how to evaluate load offerings and innovations in ballistics. Here are some final notes, regarding terminal performance and ballistics for self-protection. And that is, regarding stopping power, lethality in general, rapid blood loss is about the best benchmark that we have for obtaining rapid stopping of a target. It's totally possible to snap an animal's spine, burst its heart, or have a similar effect on a human target. It's much harder to make a shot that would be able to do that generally. So wound channels organ disruption, multiple shots, and those are the real contributing factors to rapid blood loss. So if you want to achieve rapid blood loss, you want wound channels, multiple shots, multiple wound channels, organ disruption, because that equates to faster, more rapid, higher blood loss. Okay, so the FBI is an organization that sets trend analysis. They're the ones that decided the 12-inch penetration in 10% ballistic gelatin is the minimum standard for terminal ballistics on a human target. It's pretty simple. That's what they do for law enforcement, or part of what they do for law enforcement is support it with resources, testing, and understanding of those types of tooling. And that's the standard that they've put forward after studying crime reports and after doing testing in their laboratories. Who am I to fight years and years of studies by multiple teams and multiple commissions to whether that should be the standard, minimum standard? Do I believe you can stop a target with less than 12 inches of penetration? Absolutely. Do I think that I would rather have 12 inches of penetration if I could? Absolutely. So threat stoppage, when you're talking only about threat stoppage as the overall outcome that you desire, it's almost always preferable to have significant penetration, right? It may not be the case if you've got friendly fire concerns. If you're defending a home and you've got family in the other rooms behind where you're shooting, maybe you don't want something that's guaranteed to penetrate 78 inches, right? I'm obviously running with it here, but you don't want something that's going to have multiple target hit capabilities if you can help it. So you have to factor those things in when you make a determination as to what is best to use for your use case. Another thing is the legalities of self-defense are really difficult to navigate. It's really important that you understand and are aware of self-defense guidelines, Castle Doctrine, all these different things that may come into play, especially those that are concealed carry permit holders in the various states. You need to understand when, at what point are you able to defend yourself with a firearm. If you don't do that, you're just looking for difficulty from a legal perspective. Another thing, physics has absolute laws, like we talked about earlier with, the penetration being deeper with a higher mass projectile given the same velocity. The problem is these are general guidelines. They're not necessarily something that happens and plays out in every single thing all the time. So again, understand variables change. That's why they're called variables. And when you're evaluating something, you can almost guarantee that there is no guarantee on performance. So understand you need to look at trend lines and best practices and performance reports that show best case scenarios over the long term and evaluate them apples to apples. The other thing that I want to kind of close with is you should be looking at training more often, understanding how to handle your firearm. You should understand that you should train with the ammunition and the projectiles you intend to use in a defensive situation or a duty situation with that firearm. And yes, more training absolutely equals a better chance at stopping a threat. But the most important thing, the one takeaway I hope everyone gathers from this podcast track is you should evaluate the things you read, you hear, you see online. Obviously, if it doesn't pass the gut test, maybe just move on. But if it passes the gut test, evaluate the science of it. Look for the facts that surround an opinion or surround a specific, soundbite. And then look at the trending data and look and see if that is evaluated at a law enforcement level, or look and see where there are documented case studies that show this. And then I wouldn't say experiment on your own, but go to the range and see what you can see when hitting targets at the range. And I don't just mean paper targets, right? There are other targets that you can shoot that will show differences relative to the different loads you're shooting. And so it's just important to look into the evidence that exists that supports marketing claims and to, kind of deprioritize hearsay and legends about a product. So anyway, we're going to wrap it up there. We appreciate you being here with us for another podcast, and we invite you to go check out those websites that we made this podcast in collaboration with. We'll see you next time.